You're watching The Buck Stops Here and I'm Barkha Dutt. On this Republic Day, as India displayed her military might, it's also time for all of us to remember our soldiers and the families they leave behind. The women especially, their wives. Today the whole country saw those moving, inspiring images, that moment of pain and pride when the wives of two of our martyrs stepped up to receive, in the presence of President Obama, the Gallantry Award posthumously for their husbands, both of whom were martyred in a terror attack in Jammu and Kashmir from the President of India, Pranab Mukherjee. Among them was Indu Vardarajan, the wife of Major Mukund Vardarajan, who captured the imagination of an entire country and our admiration as she stood there, stoic, strong and dignified. At 9:30 tonight, even as we celebrate Republic Day, Indu Vardarajan will be our big guest, our special guest on the program tonight. But first, let's get started with our top political and diplomatic story. President Obama's Day 2 in India began on a rain-soaked Rajpath, where he was witness, the first American president to be so, to India's Republic Day. As he sat with Prime Minister Modi and the President of India and other dignitaries, he watched India's military might and India's women power especially on display. And of course the idea of India encapsulated in that parade. Very simply, so much diversity, so much unity. But by the end of the day, it was time to move well beyond the optics and get down to business, real business. The Prime Minister and the President addressed top CEOs, top business leaders of both India and the United States of America. Both leaders spoke bluntly about how barriers in India for doing business needed to change. On the program tonight, we ask whether the personal chemistry that Mr. Modi and Barack Obama clearly share can transform the arithmetic of business. From Washington to Delhi, does the road come via Wall Street? Let's go straight across now to Anand Mahindra, the Chairman and Managing Director of the Mahindra Group, one of the most respected industrialists of India. Anand, a pleasure to have you on the program. Let me start by asking you to rewind to the time I interviewed you in New York. That's the time when Prime Minister Modi was there for the very first time. And I remember what you said. You said this is Mr. Modi stepping out on the world stage. Now he's got the President by his side here for 3 days. They've clearly clicked. They've even had chai pe charcha on the lawns of the Hyderabad house. Do you think that Mr. Modi has moved well beyond his coming out phase?
I suppose I should stick to the metaphor I used in New York then, Barkha, and say that yes, I think this is Act 2. It is still an act about, in a sense, setting the stage. It has still got a tremendous amount of histrionics and theatricals involved. There, it is a sort of grand gestures that we saw in plenty over the last couple of days. But it is Act 2. And I think that after emerging from the CEO Forum meet, it is very clear that what we are talking about has moved beyond symbolism, although I have been on record as saying that even grand symbolism is a very good thing at this point in time. But I think that from both sides, there was an appeal for deadlines, there was an appeal for targets and aspirations and metrics to be clearly set. And frankly, that was an appeal that was responded to positively by leaders. In fact, I would argue that perhaps that call came from
All right, that's Mr. Mahindra talking about the symbolism and how the symbolism has its own value. We're just going to try and get that line back to him in just a moment. Anand, go ahead, complete your point.
I don't know where I dropped off, Barkha, so I don't want to repeat myself for the audience, but I was talking about the fact that this is clearly an Act 2. That, if I use the same metaphor that I used in New York and that you alluded to about him coming out on a world stage, well, the drama continues and it is Act 2. It is an Act 2 which contains a lot of symbolism and histrionics, but there is clearly a new movement, a new kind of narrative that is emerging in the plot. And that narrative involves the clear setting out of targets and aspirations and metrics for the two countries to move together. In fact, these are aspirations and targets that one could say both of the leaders not only welcomed, but may have asked for and demanded themselves.
You know, it's interesting that you talk about the theatrics and the drama and the act too. I was just going to ask you that symbolism sometimes has its own value. And when I look at President Obama and Prime Minister Modi, I see two men who both have one thing in common. They both understand the power of the image. They understand the media movement. They have an uncanny instinct for it. Do you believe that this, masterful control over their communications narrative in some ways contributes to pushing this relationship forward, that it isn't just symbolism, it's a shared sense of showmanship?
I'm sorry you said that. Of course, you're a media person, so you would be certainly aware of the value of... I think in India, we have undervalued, both in the political world and in the business world, the value of communication, the aspect. It's always been some kind of soft and fuzzy thing, a nice to have, but you all followed by the question, where's the meat? When do we get down to substance? Your question, in a sense, asked, does the medium is the message itself, the movement towards something? In this country, we've had such deeply embedded, which have been suspicion of America. As I've said, this relationship, ambivalence, it's had so many inconsistencies and ups and downs. You almost need to sit there and, like a dentist, yank this tooth out of our mouth and say, look, we do have a natural relationship and a natural partnership. At a conference here in Delhi yesterday, I used another film metaphor and I said, this is like the old Bollywood plot of two brothers who were lost in a mela and then discover themselves after a while and suddenly shout to each other, Bhaiya, and they found each other, and we are watching that. And we are an emotional nation. We do believe in the moving image. We are the largest producer of moving images in the world. Why shouldn't communication be a force? And I think you're right. These two leaders have used it par excellence.
Fascinating analogy, Anand, from the world of films, which I know is your first love well before the business you're in. But let me ask you, as I introduce from New York today, Dr. Richard Haas, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations. But before I bring Richard in, Anand, one question to you. What's the bottom line? Business is all about bottom lines. In specific terms, what have the two countries achieved today that should give hope to business leaders on both sides?
When you are to attract global investors into India, and particularly US investors as they were the focus today, and you need them for their infrastructure investments, you need them for their technology. Let's face it, they are the largest economy in the world, and more important, they are still the most innovative economy in the world. I have always believed it's an incredibly resilient country, having lived there, its resilience, its capability to reinvent itself. And those who had counted it out, I really thought were being very short-sighted. I don't think anyone predicted that they would see a country of that size growing at 5% GDP growth, which they showed in the last quarter. So this is a country that we have to be aligned to, that if we want to progress, a relationship and a very salubrious relationship with them is in our interest. So if we want to attract their money, then you do need a climate. You do need for the American businessman to see, first of all, that this is a country where their president is going to throw his own weight economically and politically behind them. He just announced, as you know, in his speech to the larger business summit, he announced two new measures which he had on his sleeves. One was $1 billion in climate change measures to help India. That is the bottom line. You're talking dollars, and they make sense to Indian businessmen who are amount of aspiration in the solar.
Right. Let me just bring
investment
in
renewables in India is a bottom line.
Sure. Let me just get in Dr. Richard Haas for his first reactions on what have been the big takeaways. Dr. Haas, we're asking today, as we move beyond the optics and get down to business, there is, of course, the nuclear deal, the progress on the nuclear deal. There's been a concrete movement forward. From India's perspective, there's been a larger reference to a partnership which has upset China. And there's, of course, been the economics conversation today. What do you believe has been the biggest takeaway so far?
Well, I think it's wrong to look at this in the narrow sense, to use that awful word, deliverables, this or that agreement. What I think is most important is that this trip has happened and the general perception is so positive between these two leaders and between these two countries, and hopefully this begins to change what you might call the momentum of the relationship. I heard someone say, I'm sorry I couldn't tell who, that the United States and India may be natural partners. Well, fair enough, but we're natural partners who don't have much of a tradition of working together. We developed what I often call habits of cooperation. So what I'm hoping is that this trip begins to lead to something, and when historians look back in a couple of years, they'll say this was significant, not so much for what it accomplished, but more for what it led to.
Dr. Haas, you said deliverables is a terrible word, but yet diplomacy cannot function back of chemistry and optics alone. And I was just saying to Anand Mahindra that both of these leaders completely understand the power of the image, the power of the media moment. But one thing that I think a lot of Indians are curious about, we know why Prime Minister Modi would want President Obama here, but what's in it for President Obama? There are American journalists who've described him as lame duck. What is driving his investment, his energy, his time being spent in India?
Look, India is potentially one of the most important economic forces in the world. It's a country that's, what, a $2 trillion economy. It ought to be several times that. U.S.-India trade ought to be much larger than it is. Investment ought to be much larger than it is. Strategic cooperation should be much larger than it is. The big foreign policy idea of this president's first term was the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia. A closer U.S.-Indian relationship could constitute an important element of that strategic adjustment for the United States. And I would think President Obama is beginning to look to his legacy. And if he leaves the U.S.-Indian relationship in considerably better shape, if he raises it to a higher plateau, that would arguably be part of his foreign policy legacy that he would leave to his successor.
All right, we've also got on the panel now Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw of Bicon India and Nainalal Kidwai of PC India, but I want to get a last word in from Anand Mahindra. Anand, Richard Haas was just saying deliverables is a terrible word. He kind of reinforces what you've been saying, that symbolism has its own value, atmospherics have their own value. But yet, if you had to assess day two beyond the chemistry, beyond the optics, beyond the right noises, I want to ask you a question. Narendra Modi is often described less Margaret Thatcher, more India's Ronald Reagan. There have also been suggestions that he will be pulled in two different directions, one by the more conservative economics and the other by the Jagdish Bhagwati economics, where Jagdish Bhagwati actually told me in an interview that he believes Mr. Modi will even back FDI in retail very soon. So for you, is Mr. Modi Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, or just his own version of economics?
You've taken such two extreme personalities that I think you cannot help but hope that Mr. Modi would find his own happy medium between the two and be a hybrid of them both. We don't want any of the extremes that either Reagan or Thatcher implied. You want a more humane kind of face of capitalism, and yet you want a communicator who also has greater substance, and I think Mr. Modi could potentially be that. I just want one comment I want to make, since you were talking about deliverables, Barkha, and I haven't seen much discussion about this on the channels, but you know, when two leaders of economies this size and the common interests that we have meet, not everything is on the stage, to go back to the original metaphor. Parde ke piche probably is a lot that's going on, and I refer very clearly to the things, to the anti-terror discussions that they must have had. Please remember that they've met under the shadow of terror, that all the preparations here were under an atmosphere of very high alert. I cannot believe that there were not some substantive discussions on common issues of security and what does one do if there is an attack on India? What should be our response? How would we coordinate it? I think there has been, I'm almost certain there would have been discussions on the kernels of how we can coordinate with each other and have a more coherent plan in which we act together. That kind of glue that was probably going to bind us together was never on center. And I think that's a pretty hard deliverable. I'm almost certain that would have been the outcome of their discussions as well.
And very briefly, Anand, what has struck out on this visit for you so far? What's been the highlight?
I won't repeat what I said about the atmospherics and the chemistry. That's all been said before. When I was interviewed by your channel just prior to these meetings beginning, I said we've got to calibrate our expectations. Don't expect any very concrete outcomes. If there is an opera of grand gestures, so be it. As Richard said, that in itself is a movement. So I've been very pleasantly surprised by the fact that there have been very tangible outcomes, that they did get the nuclear deal signed. That is a 30 opportunity that is going to be presented to both Indian and US businessmen. And there have been metrics and targets set on every other issue in front of us. And then finally, President Obama pulled this rabbit out of his hat and just this evening announced a very hard currency, hard dollars and cents announcement of plan about funding exports to India and funding renewables. I think that's been a pleasant surprise to me and has given this entire engagement much greater substance than I had even anticipated earlier.
All right, Anand Mahindra, thank you so much for joining us. Now, since it's a day of women power for India, and we saw that at the Republic Day Parade, we've got two of the most powerful women from Indian business here, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw and Nainalal Kidwai. Privileged to have you on the program. Richard Haas is still with us, and before we get a last word in from him, I want your first impressions. The fact that now it's time to get down to business, Kiran, and you represent an industry where actually one of the thorniest issues in the trade relations is playing out, IPR and pharmaceuticals. Do you think the two countries have made any progress on that, and what are your first impressions of what you've seen so far?
I think a lot of progress has been made. I think, this was discussed at the forum, and I think it is very clear that, again, Prime Minister Modi has taken the initiative. He has moved, he has created a think tank on IPR, who has been mandated to come up with a national IPR policy. A joint committee has been set up between the two countries to really look at the initial draft that has been rolled out by the IPR think tank. Lots of very interesting and concrete developments have been suggested by this think tank. Some of which are really, really, welcome steps that have been taken. For example, they have actually suggested that dedicated IP benches be created at some of the select high courts in Mumbai, Calcutta, Chennai.
Very interesting. And Kiran, I want to explore that in a little more detail, but I just want to get a last word in from Dr. Richard Haas, who's joining us from New York. Dr. Haas, your overall impression, one of the things that Indians want to know is if this is a shift in policy, especially vis-a-vis Pakistan, perhaps with an eye on the containment of China, listing out actually terror entities in that joint statement. So do you believe that what we're seeing here is a distinct shift in American policy vis-a-vis Pakistan especially, and a leap forward in the relationship with India?
I think you're going a little bit too far. This is what I'm hoping is the beginning of a closer period of U.S.-Indian cooperation, whether against terror or in the maritime area, defense trade, intelligence. I'm hoping that is the case. Pakistan is a reality that both countries have to take into account. And what we want to do is, in Pakistan, see that government fulfill its obligations as a sovereign state to make sure that its territory is not used as a place where terrorists can operate from. That's something I'm sorry to say beyond the control of either India or the United States. And the best thing we can do is encourage the Pakistanis to take responsible steps and protect ourselves on in the possibility that they do not.
All right, Dr. Richard Haas, pleasure to have you on the program. The President of the Council on Foreign Relations, also from New York, Frank Wisner, the former U.S. Ambassador to India, a great friend of India, with us on the program. But I want to go back to our two, we've got an internal powerhouse of women here with Kiran and Naina. Naina, your big impression, beyond the optics?
Well, I think clearly it is much more than optics. If you look at the fact that two leaders have come together on the back of a relationship that had seriously deteriorated.
Who remembers Devyani Khobragade and the denial of today?
And there was a lot more in the underpinnings in the business world as well. And to now actually take it from there to a level where the two countries are talking, and talking with great warmth, and a desire to not just resolve but to march forward is very important. And two leaders meet as conductors of an orchestra. We as part of orchestra have to all deliver, and they set the tune, they set the pace, but there's everyone out there, business, bureaucrats, media, we all have to march to some tune, and that tune.
And what's the tune today? What's the tune?
I think it's a great spirit of enthusiasm.
Marching band?
A marching band going forward. I do believe that there are lots of dialogues happening. It's early days. We clearly have to deliver and sort through these issues. So if nuclear is announced, there's still people who are waiting to see the details.
We've got Westinghouse's CEO telling our correspondent that they're not sure yet. They're not sure that the legal ambiguity is not too much for them. So there's still questions.
So we have to push. We have to make sure it's clear. I take a lot of heart from the renewable space, which is very close to my heart, that it has been announced, that there's actually money behind it now, $2 billion, that has actually been stated. And our need to get 6 lakh crores worth of money into India for this sector is going to require financing from the US.
Before I go to Ambassador Wisner, Kiran, you earlier were a bit disappointed with the pace of reforms, and this next budget for this government is going to be crucial. Since you've welcomed the ordinance route, but we've had American business saying, hang on, ordinance is good, but we need the permanence of legislative action. Let me put to you the same question I put to Anand. Modinomics, Modi's economics, do we know it better, and what is his economic philosophy as you have both understood today after the roundtable and the investors meeting?
Well, I think today it was very clear from all the people from the government who participated in that very meeting, and of course finally, said in a very clear tone by Prime Minister Modi himself, that look, I think this is an opportunity that we have to now build on and very effectively act on. And I think this is something which is made very clear, that ease of doing business, simplification of regulations, speed of doing business, and basically I think it was very clearly understood that enabling the potential that we have to take this trade from $100 billion to 5-fold of that is only going to happen if you enable all the growth triggers and the opportunities. Now, I think the way I've seen it, I've been with the US-India Business Forum for the last 10 years, ever since it was formed. And what I found is that there is a perceptible shift in the way we are working towards this bilateral cooperation. In the past, it was very tactical. Today you can clearly see the strategic shift.
Very interesting. Let me go across now to New York, where Ambassador Wisner is with us. What's the big picture? You're all the way, you're joining us all the way from New York. Frank, what does day 2 look like? At the end of day 2, where do our two countries stand?
Well, I think we stand on a much firmer basis. While personal relationships are important in all fields of endeavor, I've never seen anything quite like the bonding between our two leaders. And that has an impact on the way our governments, our public opinions see the relationship. This relationship has now been codified in a number of dialogues, in statements of intent, and then in very practical ways, in defense, in trade, in climate change, in the field of IPR that Kiran has addressed, a wide variety of activities. And then there is the Prime Minister's own personal assurance to American business that the doors of India are open and welcoming. I think if you put it all together, we are launching off a strong footing and we'll be able to make some measurable progress. A lot of hard work, of course, setbacks always occur, but I think this is a very strong recommencement of the relationship.
Ambassador, can I ask you what has stood out for you in everything you've seen so far? The personal bonding is clearly one such thing. I think they're also joined by their instinct for the media, by their shared informality. They can slip in a casual reference there. What explains the fact that these two men have clicked, given the whole acrimonious history with, between Modi and the United States?
Well, I think at the heart is a strategic convergence. Both of us face significant issues in the world, a need of a balance of power in Asia, a need to deal with threats to regional security that affect India and the United States equivalently, a recognition on our part that a strong India is good for the United States, and a recognition on India's part that a strong America, successful America, is good for Indian interests. And this has taken us into some very important national security decisions in defense trade, in cooperation, looking at South China Sea, maritime, freedom of maritime, the real signal that we want to have a secure space with China. Beyond that, in the other fields that we've touched on, in business, the environment, really it's a fascinating, broad brush relationship.
Let me take this back to Kiran Shaw and Naina Lalkidwai. Naina, a number of the American business leaders I've been interviewing in the last 2 days have all been saying, look, we're still watchful. I don't know if they've changed their mind after this evening's meeting, but they've been saying we're still watchful. We're worried about certain laws that still exist. They particularly are worried about the retrospective tax law being on the books, despite the government saying that we're not going to use it. Where do you think the Modi government needs to move the most urgently to address some of these concerns?
Well, I think tax, just exactly as you say, has been paramount, and the government has moved. I think the government, by not taking the transfer pricing High Court judgment to the Supreme Court, which it could have done, is an indication to understand the imperatives of business here. And their assurances on retrospective tax are very real. I mean, I cannot think how many times one has heard the finance minister say it.
And that's true, but would you want them to scrap it?
I would love to see it go away, because it has been an absolute bugbear, not just for foreign companies, but for Indian as well, for any business operating here. But assurance as it stands today, and for reasons, it hasn't been taken away, is, I think, at least a step in the right direction. Now it can only be in terms of how things play out. So I understand where businesses are in terms of we will wait and see. But I do believe that as the engagement goes up and they begin to buy into these assurances, we will see the engagement levels go up. And one of the key areas is going to be about companies, small Indian companies becoming part of global supply chains, for example. And US multinationals become key to helping get the levels of delivery up.
That's the cue for my next question to Kiran. Is there a possible collision between the Make in India slogan of Mr. Modi and the Made in USA motto of America? We've seen the concerns that even President Obama expressed in the past over outsourcing. We're now seeing the Indians push even harder for companies to come here and manufacture. Do you see a competitive protectionism despite both leaders today talking about economic reform?
I like to believe that there is an equitable model where both countries will benefit out of a manufacturing strategy. And I think that strategy is very doable. I mean, even if you look at the pharma sector, which really we talked about, and we said that, we do have a very cost-effective manufacturing base, which even the US benefits from. And I think that is something which really needs to be looked at in a way that benefits the economy just as it benefits us. Now, in certain sectors, you might find more jobs going to one partner than the other. But I think there is a win-win opportunity of creating jobs at both sides of the equation. And I think that's why I said, I think this is now about working out a strategy more than just looking at what does this do or what does that do. And I like to believe that what we are seeing today is a very strong willingness to pursue any kind of an agenda joint. And I think that's the first time I've seen it.
Interesting. Now I want to ask...
And if I may just add, there was another thing which came across very strongly was that there was a clear understanding from the Indian side that they are in a, they have to get things done. There was a strong indication and commitment to, ease of doing business. Certainly taxation was a point which was raised by a number of members. And I think the finance minister clearly said that he wants to make retrospective taxation a thing of the past. So I think those kind of messagings were very important.
Okay, I want to ask all three of you for last comments now. I'll start with you, Ambassador Wisner. The standout moment of the trip so far. All three of you, the standout moment, your standout moment. I'll start with you, Ambassador.
Well, I think my standout moment is the extraordinary equation between the two leaders and the mood that's been set. I think it's enormously important, the agreements that they've reached. Some of them we did not think they'd get this far, on civil nuclear, on IPR, on climate, on defense trade. But really there is a sense that we have a common purpose and common interests in the region's security and a common purpose and interest in each other's success. That's the overall impression I come away with.
Okay, Naina, your standout moment.
I think it's the whole spirit of partnership and collaboration that has come to the language of the way our two nations work. And within it, of course, the business community also being required to collaborate. And within that, I think, again, renewables beginning to figure is so important for India. And we do need the technology and the financing that the US can bring to help in this agenda going forward.
Kiran, last word to you.
Well, I think the strong sense of common purpose, common agenda, and this very strong sense of strategic partnership really came out very strong this time. I think across the board, whether it was the chemistry you saw between the two leaders, whether it was the business forum meetings that you saw, I think they were sort of very synchronized and aligned in what they were trying to say and communicate to everyone. And I thought that alignment it all.
And now going forward they'll be measured by specifics, because you can only travel so far on optics, but the optics certainly have been fantastic on this trip, as is some of the messaging. Kiran Shaw, Naina Lal Kidwai, Ambassador Frank Wisner, pleasure to have you all on the special broadcast of the Buck Stops here. We'll be taking a quick break after this, but a very special guest is coming up. We all saw her on television this morning accepting a gallantry award for her husband, Major Mukund.